Okay, let me just start with the basics of the Federal Reserve, what it is, what it's not, and then I want to talk about some of the myths that have grown up about it, or around it, and that have been promoted, of course, by the Fed itself. Okay, first thing to point out is that the Fed bills itself as an inflation fighter. Okay, not only is the Fed not an inflation fighter, it is the only organization that is capable of causing inflation because it has a monopoly of the money supply. It has a legal monopoly of creating money. Now I'm going to use the term printing money, though it actually technically doesn't print money, as Ben Bernanke technically did not lie on 60 Minutes when he said the Fed is not printing money, okay? But in spirit, it's a big prevarication. He lied, okay? Okay, since now the Fed can create money really in cyberspace with one keystroke. That's how it actually does create money. I'll go into that. But before we go into that, there's an iron, what I call an iron law of monopoly. Okay, anyone who has a legal monopoly in any area will use it to achieve their own ends. Okay, whatever those ends are, they could be selfish, they could be altruistic. Let's say that the saintly Mother Teresa was still alive, and for some reason she was given the legal right to print money. Okay, she's selfless. She wants to help the poor. Well, she would print a few $100 billion to feed more poor people, possibly build them homes. Okay, even I, a committed libertarian, were I given the monopoly to print money, I would print billions up to help the Ron Paul campaign. To set up a free market university with myself as president, with a dignified salary, of course. But regardless of the motives of those in charge of the monopoly of money, the effects will always be the same. Rising prices, a redistribution of wealth from those who do not get the money early on and have to pay the higher prices for a while, to those who get the money first, and to the money printers themselves, of course. In the real world, okay, let's get away from fantasy. In the real world, if anyone did what the Fed did, they would be arrested and prosecuted for counterfeiting. Okay? In fact, during World War II, both the British government and the German government tried to steal each other's money printing plates so that they could print up money, drop it over the country, and destroy the currency. The United States had plans to do this in the Vietnam War. They never came to fruition. That is to reproduce perfectly North Vietnamese currency notes and shower them on the countryside, which is, of course, what Ben Bernanke is doing now, helicopter Ben. So, something else to keep in mind. Inflation is not the result of monopoly pricing by business. It's not the result of greedy wage demands by unions. It is not the result of OPEC charging outrageous prices and price gouging on oil, or even of piggish consumers going on spending splurges. That's all a smokescreen by the Fed, okay? There is one and only one cause of inflation, and that is the power to expand the money supply. And where does that power lie? Legally with the Fed. So the Fed is not an inflation fighter, it is an inflation creator, always and everywhere. Okay. Nor is the Fed really a protector against business downturns, unemployment, recessions, and all other nonsense, okay? In fact, in the course of printing new money, they distort interest rates. And that creates paper profits, and it creates false capital gains that make people allocate or make investments in wrong areas that later have to be liquidated. It also causes the creation of jobs doing the wrong things. So recessions are the free market striking back, the invisible hand striking back against government and trying to rearrange resources and workers so that they best serve the demands of consumers. But ultimately, it is caused by inflation. Let's talk about some other myths about the Fed. Now, the Fed claims that it has performed well in preserving the value of our dollar. Okay, if you had a dollar in 1913, it would take you $22.67 to buy the same thing today that could have been bought with $1 then. That means that our dollar is in effect worth 5 cents. okay, based on the 1913 dollar. We went off the gold standard in 1933, so let's take that point. From that point forward, the dollar has lost 94% of its value. It's now worth 6 cents from 1933. And here's what I want to just quickly read something from my cell phone. The executive order taking us off the gold standard. Yeah. And all I want to say here is, under the executive order of the President, all persons are required to deliver on or before May 1st, 1933, all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates now owned by them to a Federal Reserve bank, branch, or agency. And then, after a long bunch of bureaucratic speech, it ends with criminal penalties for violation of the executive order, $10,000 fine or 10 years imprisonment, or both. Now, that was not repealed. U.S. citizens could not own gold unless you were a licensed jeweler or dentist until 1976. It was even against the law to own gold outside the country, in Canada, for example. Okay. Since that time, now, well, if you compare the dollar to that time, as I said, it's worth only 6 cents. We went back to a watered-down gold standard after World War II, from about 1946 to 1971. We had what was called the Bretton Woods system, in which a dollar was convertible into gold, though not for you or I or our parents or grandparents, but for foreign central banks and foreign governments. Because the U.S. government then had the right to inflate, because the dollar now is the only currency convertible into gold, foreign governments would then accept those dollars as if they were gold. So there was no reason for us not to continue to run deficits and finance them by monetizing the debt. And that's what we did during the 60s, to pay for the war on poverty and the war in Vietnam, both of which were monstrous wars. Well, what happened? Of course you know what happened. Prices rose tremendously in the U.S. compared to Europe, so that the Germans, the French, and other countries demanded that their dollars that they were accumulating in their central banks be redeemed in gold. We blackmailed the Germans into withdrawing their demands by claiming that, well, you know, we might have to remove our nuclear umbrella, protect you against the Russians if you don't withdraw your demands. The French, on the other hand, thumbed their noses. They dropped out of NATO. They started their own nuclear force. Okay. However, even the U.S., with all its power, couldn't prevent the run on gold. So that in 1971, in the last 2 weeks before Nixon closed the gold window, we would have run out of gold in 2 weeks. Okay, we had gone from $25 billion worth of gold in 1950s down to $9 billion. Since that time, the prices have increased by about 5 times. Okay, a dollar today is worth only 19 cents of what it was in 1971. Okay. Finally, let's take the high tide of central banking. Now, Bernanke, in a speech in 2004, claimed that central banks had solved the problem of inflation and recession, and he called it the Great Moderation. And this took place, allegedly, between 1984 and 2005. So let's give him that period of time. The dollar lost half of its value during that time. Okay? And this is after the central bank supposedly had finally figured out how to run things, okay, in the beginning of 1984. So the dollar was worth 48 cents in 2005 compared to its 1984 value. This is hardly a good job. Okay? I need not emphasize that. In fact, if you look at 1914, we had $11 billion in the money supply in checking accounts and currency. That has grown from 11 billion until today. We have $10 trillion in the money supply. Okay? The money supply has increased 900 times. Okay? In percentage terms, that's about 90,000%. How did it increase? The Fed increased it simply by using the word printing money, but really just creating money out of thin air and by simply buying bonds, and we'll get to that. Okay? Let me just make one more comparison. and this is another myth, before the Fed was established, the myth goes, the gold standard did not perform well in preventing fluctuations in the value of the dollar. Now, if you take 1800 as a standard, and then look at the 1913 dollar, okay, the year before the Fed started operations, you could actually buy in 1913 a dollar's worth of goods in 1800 was worth, you could have bought for 79 cents. So the dollar actually increased in value under the gold standard. It increased from $1 to about $1.27. It could buy 27 cents more. Okay, and if you look from 1800 to 1896, before we've had a lot of gold discoveries, the dollar was worth $1.22. Now let's look at the exchange rate value of the dollar. Since 1973, against major currencies, which also are inflating, the U.S. has lost 30% of its value. The U.S. dollar has lost 30% of its value, okay, against this basket of currencies, meaning that we're inflating at a higher rate. If you take a very strong currency like the yen, the U.S. dollar used to be worth 360 yen. It's now worth 80 yen. Okay? It's lost 75% of its value against the yen currency. How is this a good job? I don't get it. Like, neither does Ben. Okay. All right, let me just say a few words about another myth. The Federal Reserve was created in order to protect the public interest by preventing financial crises and stabilizing the economy. Let me just tell you a little story. I'll try to make it as brief as possible. After the Civil War, the U.S. banking system had a cartel. It was called the National Banking System. What that did was to really centralize control in the Wall Street banks, though it did not have total control. It definitely made it easier for them to earn income by inflating the money supply and then lending that created money out at interest. But what would happen was, every time they created an inflation, okay, prices would rise, banks would lose their gold reserves as people began to buy goods abroad and had to pay in gold, that is, they would buy more imports. And at that point, the bank would have to stop inflating. And so some of the banks would go bankrupt because some of their borrowers could not pay the money back because of the recession that was occurring. The bank would stop inflating, raise interest rates, you would have business failures, and a failure of the businesses to pay back their loans. People would see this and they would go and demand their gold be redeemed for the checking account money or the currency. Okay. This caused panics of 1873, of 1882, of 1890, of 1893, and in 1907. So we had a number of panics. Now, this is usually blamed on the gold standard, but the point was that these panics occurred because the gold standard restrained the banks from continuing to inflate. So the gold standard was called the golden handcuffs. Every time the banks became too inflationary, they faced the loss of gold reserves, as people withdrew their gold, fearful that the banks would fail. So bank failures were a good thing. Now, of course, the Wall Street banks didn't think that was true. They began to complain about something they called the elasticity of the currency. The currency is not elastic, meaning there's no one there to inflate reserves so that we can pay back our depositors when they come in demanding reserves. So they began to push in the 1890s for a central bank, which they called a lender of last resort, basically an inflator of last resort. There was also a movement to sidestep the banks by William Jennings Bryan. He wanted to monetize silver. He wanted inflation, but he didn't want it through the banks. So the banks were worried about the panics. They were worried about the loss of control that would have occurred if the government began to inflate directly by issuing treasury notes against silver. So the bankers got together and they began to push this idea that we needed a central bank. But the American public was extremely hostile to central banking and to monopolization. You still had the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian tradition. Okay? President Jefferson had destroyed the first bank of the U.S., which was a quasi-central bank, and Jackson fought a long and bitter war to destroy the second bank of the U.S. in the 1830s, okay, which is also a quasi-central bank. So that was still in the American psyche. So how did the bankers get this whole thing across? to make a long story short, this was a progressive era where enlightened businessmen made alliances with professionals, MDs, clergy, academics, all people who wanted to professionalize their occupations, and in return get special privileges from government to keep other people out of their profession, and to get jobs and grants from government, especially academics, economists, sociologists, and so on. So, what they did then was to get together and come up with this line. And the line was, government planning and regulations are necessary to protect the public interest against which is representing consumers, workers, and farmers, against exploitation by big business monopoly, and to save capitalism from the excesses of the free market. Okay? Well, the first movement to do this failed in 1902. They tried to get a bill across, but the small banks that were outside the cartel killed the bill. But then in 1910, they began to do it again, or actually 1907, after the panic of 1907. And so for 3 years, they beamed propaganda at the American public. This all culminated in 1910 in a week-long infamous conference at Jekyll Island, in which 6 bankers, academics, and politicians got together. They were all connected to the Morgan and Rockefeller financial empires, and they hammered out a bill, which 3 years later, in almost unchanged form, was passed and signed by President Wilson, and that was the Federal Reserve Act. Okay. So that was a great Christmas present that he gave us. Okay. See, he signed it right before Christmas. All right, now let me talk about the myth that the Fed does not print money, which is what Bernanke had told us on the 60 Minutes interview. Instead, it controls interest rates, okay? Or it engages in quantitative easing. Well, it pains me to admit it, Bernanke is technically right. The Fed does not literally print money. It creates money through a fractional reserve banking system. Which means that each bank, all your banks, hold, by law, a minimum of 10% of your banking deposits. 10% of your checking accounts and 0% of your savings accounts. They can then loan the other 90% out. So if you deposit $10,000 in your checking account, and by the way, if you move $10,000 anywhere, of course, you have to fill out all these forms today. And that's the war against cash, but that's another story. So if you put that $10,000 in a bank, they hold $1,000. They keep that in their ATM machines, in their vaults, on reserve at the Fed. And then the other $9,000 they loan out. So you have $10,000, and then when that bank loans the money out, and the borrower spends it on something, a small businessman spends it on expanding, let's say, his dry cleaning operation, that money then is placed by his suppliers into the banks and creates another checking account for another $9,000. Now you have $19,000. That bank then holds $900 and loans out $8,100. That's redeposited. Okay? So now you get a multiple expansion or multiple deposit creation mechanism operating under fractional reserve banking, which increases every Fed dollar or every dollar that the Fed injects increases up to a maximum of 10 times. So if the Fed injects $100 million on a given day into the bond markets by simply buying bonds, I'll talk about that in a moment, what happens is then that becomes, over time, can become up to 1 billion new dollars of checking account money in the economy. Okay? So basically, whenever fractional reserve banks make any kind of a loan, they create money. Okay? It also causes a redistribution of income from those who get the new money first to those, or to those who get the new money first, from those people like you and I who may not get that new money for another 18 months. That is, prices begin to rise, our incomes stay the same, our salaries stay the same, we have to pay the higher prices. If prices rise by 10% over that 18 months, your real income has shrunk by 10%. Okay. And it also artificially reduces interest rates, because when the banks loan this money out, there's extra money, a greater supply of money to be loaned out. The only way you get people to borrow that additional money is to lower interest rates a little bit. And that causes bad investments and overconsumption, and it causes recessions. Okay, so how does the Fed actually print money? Well, they actually do it about 3 blocks from my office. I work at Pace University in New York City, a business school right almost on Wall Street. So the New York Federal Reserve Bank, every day between 9 and 11, it's called Fed time, they hold an auction in which they buy bonds, okay, and up until a few years ago, that's all they bought was government bonds, but since then they've been buying other things. But they buy bonds from 30 selected, privileged banks and bond dealers, Goldman Sachs, for example, and others, okay? And let's say they buy $100 million worth of bonds. Now let me step back for a moment. Since 1980, the Fed can buy literally anything, okay? I sold an SUV last year, a used SUV, okay? It's an epic tragedy if my wife has to keep a car more than 3 years. So, okay, so we had to sell the SUV. So I sold it for $10,000. Now let's say the Fed, as part of its quantitative easing program, was buying SUVs. What they would do is simply print up a check, sign it to Fed, write it out for $10,000 to me. I would then deposit it in my bank, and presto, the bank now has $10,000 that it can loan out. Now, the Fed wouldn't even really write me a check. What it would really do is to hit the keystroke, make an electronic entry, increasing my bank's reserves by $10,000. The bank would then increase my account by 10. It would all be done electronically in cyberspace. Okay? So the money is conjured up out of nothing. Now, in the real world, during Fed time, every day, they buy tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars worth of bonds. From 2001 to 2005, and this is what created the bubble, by the way, the Fed increased the money supply by $2 trillion, from $5 trillion to $7 trillion. So at the beginning of 2001, it was $5 trillion. By the end of 2005, it was $7 trillion. That works out to an increase in the money supply of $1 billion per day. Just a back of the envelope calculation I did last night. They created $1 billion a day. Well, of course asset prices went up. Are they idiots? What else is going to happen to this money? Okay? So housing prices, stock prices went up and so on. There's something else, another way the Fed can create money. Your bank needs a loan, and it doesn't have quite enough reserves, so it has to, and it wants to loan more money out and so on. So what your bank does is in the morning call up the Fed officer and its regional bank loan officer and say, we need a loan of $50 million. Okay. At the end of the day, the Fed officer says, you have the loan. Now where's the money? All the Fed did was to go into the bank's reserve account, which is held at the regional Fed, and simply credit $50 million to that bank. There's no money, there's nothing you can see, there's no printing. The bank then has the right to create $50 million of new deposits and loan them out at interest. Okay? So that's how the Fed creates money. I call this deflation phobia, and it has swept the Fed and academic economists since around 2000, okay? And it was promoted by Alan Greenspan and Bernanke himself. They saw that prices were falling in Japan very modestly during the 1990s, and that Japan had, at the same time, a depression. So they mistook one for the cause of the other. Falling prices, we'll see, do not cause depression. Falling prices are a result of a healthy, growing, prospering economy, which we'll get to. So what happened in 2002, when Bernanke was just a governor of the Fed, he gave a talk that at first no one really paid attention to. He wasn't the Fed chairman, they really just paid attention to Greenspan, basically. But he gave a talk in November in Washington here, November 2002. It was called Deflation, Making Sure It Doesn't Happen Here. Okay. And it had to have been cleared by Greenspan, since he was a chairman of the Fed. And he began his speech by affirming the belief, quote, that the chance of significant deflation in the United States in the foreseeable future is extremely small. Okay, so then shut up and move on to something else. Then he expressed confidence that the Fed would take whatever means necessary to prevent significant deflation in the United States, and moreover, that the U.S. Central Bank, in cooperation with other parts of the government as needed, has sufficient policy instruments to ensure that any deflation that might occur would be both mild and brief. So why should we worry about it? Well, he wanted you to worry about it because this was setting the stage for an enormous inflation that caused the housing bubble, which I just talked about. He added, so having said that deflation in the United States is highly unlikely, and I'm quoting him, I would be imprudent to rule out the possibility altogether. So this is where he began to scare the American people. Well, he went through a whole list of different policy instruments which the Fed could use, unconventional instruments, which it is now using now. So in 2002, he was setting out the agenda for 2008. Okay? So the Fed could use these instruments, which is beyond regular open market operations, which I talked about, to stop deflation. And then he wrote the following. He said, the conclusion that deflation is always reversible under a fiat money system follows from basic economic reasoning. A little parable may prove useful. Today, an ounce of gold sells for $300, more or less, okay, if he wishes. That was back in 2002. As a result of his policies, it's now selling for $1,400. Now suppose that a modern alchemist solves his subject's oldest problem by finding a way to produce unlimited amounts of gold at essentially no cost. Moreover, his invention is widely publicized and scientifically verified. And he announces his intention to begin massive production of gold within days. What would happen to the price of gold? Bernanke asks. And he goes on to answer. He says, if there's a potentially unlimited supply of gold, its price would plunge. Okay? Immediately after the announcement. Now, he says, what does this have to do with monetary policy? He says, like gold, US dollars have value only to the extent that they are strictly limited in supply. But the US government has a technology called a printing press. Now, he understood that he wasn't just printing money. He says in parentheses, or today, its electronic equivalent, that allows it to produce as many US dollars as it wishes at essentially no cost. It costs about 2 to 4 cents to print a new $100 bill. And just to create money in computers, almost nothing. By increasing the number of US dollars in circulation, or even threatening to do so, the US government can also reduce the value of dollars in terms of goods and services, which is equivalent to raising the prices in dollars of these goods and services. We conclude then, under a paper money system, a determined government can always generate higher spending and inflation. So what was he doing there? I mean, it's really a chilling passage. What he's telling us is that we're going to risk scaring people into spending money to raise prices by threatening to inflate the money supply. Okay? That way lies hyperinflation, which is exactly what they're doing now. Okay? By announcing that we're going to have a QE2, quantitative easing 2, of $600 billion, announcing that in advance. Usually the Fed doesn't announce anything in advance. The Fed is very secretive. It releases its minutes months later. Okay, it only gives you, every time it meets the FOMC, it only gives you a very, very short press release. Okay? So why would he be announcing this? To scare you and me into fearing higher prices in the future and stampeding to buy things that we would need in the future, like homes, automobiles, so on. Buy them now. Okay? And that's hyperinflation. Okay? But let me just sort of refute that. What's bad about falling prices? Okay? Is anyone worried about the fact that HD TVs are falling in price? No. iPhones? I love it. I want all prices to fall to a nickel. Okay? Because falling prices in a capitalist economy with a sound money like gold, which is what occurred from 1800 to 1913, means that goods are becoming more abundant. And that the increase in the money supply, in this case gold, is very, very slow. It's determined by costs of production and the demand for gold in industrial uses or in money. So, in fact, really falling prices or deflation is really an increase in the value of money. It's the dollar being able to buy more. Okay? So, for example, let's take the case of deflation in the high-tech industries. You could buy a mainframe computer from IBM, which would probably fill half this room, for $4.7 million in 1970. You could buy a computer today that's less than $500, and it's tiny, a PC, that's more than 20 times, probably 50 times faster now. Okay, it has more memory than that computer. Prices have fallen by 90% overall in those industries. Okay, Now, has that destroyed the computer industry? Has that caused massive unemployment? No. In 1980, for example, 490,000 PCs were shipped, less than 500,000. By the year 2000, 43 million units were shipped. Okay? In the meantime, prices have fallen by 90%. When there is growth, and as a result of technological improvement in the capitalist economy, and the fact that people save and invest more, what you get is falling prices and falling costs. So the profit margin doesn't change. Prices and costs fall. So you do not get depression. Deflation does not cause depression. Deflation is evidence of a prospering economy, a growing economy. Okay. There's a few other things I could say, maybe I'll just say one other thing about QE2, and then I'll stop and I'll take questions. So the Fed had claims that quantitative easing is necessary, which is another word for inflation, to restart our economy. Okay, so we had quantitative easing from 2009 to 2008 to about 2010, the first round of quantitative easing. It increased bank reserves by about $1.4 trillion. Okay, unemployment stayed above 9%. Now we have the second round announced in November, another $600 billion in quantitative easing, which, remember, when it gets into circulation is going to be multiplied by up to 10 times, okay, causing a massive inflation in the U.S. economy. What has resulted? I did some quick calculations very quickly. What did we see in the last few months? We've seen purchases of long-term Treasury securities rising, which was basically quantitative easing was supposed to push interest rates down, which it did for a while, but now as people expect inflation, they've risen from around 2.5% to 3.5% in the last year. That is the interest rates on 10-year bonds. We've seen mortgage rates going up. Mortgage rates hit a low of 4.25% last year. Now they just went over 5%, the average for 30-year mortgages. I read that in the paper yesterday. Commodity prices have risen by 23% in the last year. Cotton prices have hit their highest nominal value since the Civil War. In the last 2 years, the Fed has reignited the stock market boom. It's increased by 84%, okay, in 2 years. So what's the solution? Solution, outside of the initial step of auditing the Fed to find out how cozy they were with all of these firms they bailed out and whether or not they knowingly overpaid for the assets that they bought, and if they did, how much is this going to cost taxpayers in losses? Okay, we want to know all of those things. That's what an audit would do. But the ultimate solution is to abolish the Fed. And you do that with two steps. It's a rotten, corrupt, secretive organization that has no place in a republic. So how do we abolish it? We take two steps. One, we allow alternative currencies to develop. Abolish all taxes, excise, sales, capital gains taxes on gold and silver. Abolish all legal tender laws and allow people their God-given right of making contracts in whatever medium they agree upon. And very importantly, allow gold and silver deposits and foreign currency deposits. Let's allow Americans to hold yen checking accounts and yuan checking accounts. Let's see China and Japan outcompete the US dollar, just showing what a rotten system we have. And make it illegal for the Fed to purchase any more assets. No more buying bonds, mortgages, my SUV, nothing. Okay? Because if you do that, they can't create any money. Also, they can loan banks money. Well, raise the rate to 10% or 12% so that the banks have no incentive to borrow anymore from the Fed. Okay? Then Bernanke can just sit there and twiddle his thumbs. And then force them, since the banks are holding so many excess reserves, we have actually enough reserves in the system to back up every dollar of checking account money by 100%, okay? So let's go back to 100% banking. After that, we can go back and see if people prefer gold, silver, or another currency, okay? So that's what I would, that's my solution to the problem, okay? So I'll end here and take questions. Thank you.